Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to begin by talking about Father Isaac Eckert. Now, he is perhaps one of the most prominent American Catholics in the 19th century, born on December 18th, 1819, the founder of the Paulists. But he didn't begin as a Paulist. Let's talk about his young life.
Well, and actually he didn't even begin as anyone who would be on the road to being a renowned Catholic theologian or Catholic scholar. We do know, though, that from the earliest days he had a very keen intellectual curiosity. And so initially that brings him to, in his early 20s, be part of a movement that was at a place called Brook Farm. And what this was a community that was dedicated to the search for a better way of life. And we see other intellectuals and authors and people of the time that are part of that movement, people like Hawthorne and Thoreau and Emerson. So we see that he has this great intellectual ability because he's keeping pace with these types of people. But eventually then, he starts to become more immersed in Catholic writings and in Catholic theology. And so the study of the Catholic religion is something that becomes his main primary focus. Perhaps still on that journey of finding that better way of life, he finds that living the Catholic faith is what's going to bring that about for him. And eventually we see that he decides to enter the Catholic faith. He's conditionally baptized in Old St. Patrick Cathedral by Bishop John McCloskey, later to become America's first cardinal. And that is on August 2nd, 1844. He also felt this call then to religious life. And we see that he enters the Redemptorist novitiate, and he did that in 1845 when he was 26 years old. But then after his ordination, there was this calling to do something more, to be something more. So eventually he leaves the Redemptorists after 12 years. And what happens then? Well, he and a few others are canonically released by the Pope from being part of this religious community, and then the desire to form a new community. And so we see that, as you said, the founder of the Paulists, that he forms this new community. And really what this great desire does is this congregation of missionary priests for St. Paul the Apostle is the only religious community founded solely with the purpose of providing missionary work to the United States. We tend nowadays to think of missionaries from the United States going abroad. We have missionaries that go to Africa and to Central America or South America or other parts of the world. It is interesting to note also that we ourselves were, and in certain parts still are, mission territory where other people will come here. So large numbers of Irish priests that left Ireland and came here. But to be within the United States and to do missionary work within the United States becomes that complete charism of the Paulists. It's really kind of, to lack of a better word, foreign to us to have missions here in our own country, because as you had mentioned, when we think of a missionary, we think of someone going to the Far East or to Africa. But a missionary here in our own country to evangelize, and their charism is primarily to preach to the poor. And he does that in a spirit of St. Paul and forms this congregation of the Paulists. It's called the Congregation of the Missionary Priests of St. Paul the Apostle, or as we know, the Paulists. He only lives to the age of 69, but for 30 years he works in this congregation. And we see that there's many things that happen, even literarily, out of this congregation. So let's talk about that periodical that becomes part of the Paulist community. Well, as you said, one of their great ministries is the printed word. And we see then that in 1865, there is the foundation of the Catholic World, a monthly magazine that serves the church for more than a century. And we see then that this is helping to really reach out to people who can continue to form and develop and cultivate a mind focused on how we are called to live our lives as Catholics. One of the things that's interesting is that he himself had been involved in writings and articles that even kind of bordered on how to take the political thought of the world in which we live and to bring that to a greater understanding. One of the things I remember he's quoted as talking about is that there was an unsatisfied active intelligence in an active mind. And so that we needed to reach out to people, to pique their curiosity, to help their understanding, and to grow in all of these different forms of knowledge. And for him, that it all had to be tempered with a love of our faith and our service to the poor. So this periodical helps people to foster and form that.
You know, it's interesting because he finds himself not only finding or founding this religious community, but also battling what some would call Protestantism or Americanism, and so trying to adhere to the roots of the faith and trying to encourage people who are Catholic to maintain their Catholic faith amidst this desire to be more American than Catholic. Mm-hmm. And so as we see this continuing, we also understand that Father Eckert, who is continuing to be moved and guided by the Spirit to maintain this charism of the Paulist, to preach to the poor, to evangelize God's people, and to do so using any means possible. And especially, as you had mentioned, with the print medium of the Catholic world. And how important is it in closing of this particular segment for us to be people who understand the faith and who learn more about why we are Catholic and how important it is for us to maintain that?
Well, I think as was the case for him in our current age, it's that understanding of how we are a more, this global community has us being in solidarity with each other. That by living that life of Christ, we're to reach out to one another regardless of station or position in life. I think everything is cyclical, and perhaps some of the groups that he had to reach out to, that, as you said, that sense of Americanism or whatever it was that would have them not wanting to focus on other groups coming into the country, other groups who needed ministered to or served to. In that cyclical sense, the names and countries and backgrounds change, but there's always that need to reach out and to care for one another and to serve one another. And that certainly was the work of Isaac Eckert, and it's the work we're called to today.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Available through St. Paul's Books and Gifts is a small treatise on peace of heart, both in book and audiobook form, by author Father Jacques Philippe, well-known preacher and retreatant from France. For more information on this item and many more, please visit the bookstore at 926 Boardman Canfield Road in Boardman, or call 330-953-2443, or visit their website at www.stpaulsusa.com. This book, Searching for and Maintaining Peace, is there to help you pursue peace of heart as a pure gift of God. Again, that phone number is 330-953-2443, or visit their website at www.stpaulsusa.com.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Frank Parater. It's interesting because this gentleman that we're going to talk about was a 22-year-old seminarian who died in Rome at the North American College. Kind of a simple life. Let's begin by talking about where he was from and his desire to be a priest.
Well, he was from the Diocese of Richmond, Virginia, and he obviously comes from a family that supports his vocation. We see his early age. He is chosen to go and study at the North American College, as you said, in Rome. And while he is there, he contracts rheumatic fever. Now, one of the interesting things about him, and why we know some of his writings and why we're even talking about him today, is that it's understood that a year before his death, he's in perfect health. But there's some sense that maybe he's not long for this world. So even a young man of 19 in perfect health with his whole life ahead of him, he stops and prayerfully reflects and writes a last will and testament. His last will and testament is not one of leaving possessions to things, but really that sense of testament. He makes this last statement about his faith, about his desire to be with God, and what we know is that this is discovered by a classmate who's collecting his belongings at the instruction of the rector. And from him discovering that, the classmate thinks that it's so important, somehow he gets it transmitted to the Vatican newspaper who publishes it, and it even makes its way to the Pope at the time, Pope Benedict XV, who reads this article.
And we're going to talk a little bit about the actual testament itself, but he kind of likens himself, because of his young age, to three other saints who died at a young age, namely John Birchmans, who died at the age of 22, Aloysius Gonzaga, another seminarian, who died at the age of 23, and Stanislaus Kostka at the age of 18. And some of what he writes, as you had mentioned, is that he says, "I've nothing to leave but my life," that he consecrates to the Sacred Heart. And so that in itself is really a testament that in the end, as we come into this world, we come in with nothing. And in the end, when we leave this world, we leave with nothing. And so there's that sense that all that we have in this life are primarily gifts that God has given us. And so when we leave with nothing but our life. I wonder why his desire and his adoration and devotion to the Sacred Heart was something important and special, and perhaps we could mention that as we get into a little bit more about his last will and testament.
Well, certainly in recognizing that Sacred Heart of Jesus, which is all loving and all forgiving and all merciful, to surrender oneself over. And as you said, to have nothing to give, but perhaps to have the greatest gift to give, which is his own life to be a reflection of that love and that mercy and that peace. We know that as he goes on in those writings, he mentions that he doesn't want this testament to be seen as anything that is melancholy or morbid. The fact that a young man is thinking of his own impending death. And as we said, wrote this when he was healthy, but had a premonition of what may come. What his desire is to kind of be an instruction to his classmates, to his brother seminarians, to others who may be on the journey to priesthood, or to all of us living a life centered on Christ, was to be one in which we want to be with the saints. That was one of his great desires, that he wanted not only to be buried with the saints, but to live with the saints. And in choosing those three in particular, seeing that it is possible. I think that's what he was reminding his classmates, is that this is not anything unique or out of the ordinary. There have been other people of young age who were able to live a life of faith, who were able to overcome obstacles, who for whatever reason left this world early by our understanding or hope, but yet were able to live a life centered and focused on God. So he puts himself in their company not to exalt himself, but perhaps as a challenge that it's possible for us.
It's interesting. He also continues to say that, since he was a child, he has this desire to die for the love of God and for my fellow man. Whether or not I shall receive that favor, I know not. But, there's the sense that the death was never something that he feared, but death actually came as a welcome friend for him, because this was something that he desired as a young child. And he knew that throughout all of this, this brief illness that he had, as he reflected back on his writings, that this was something that was always part of his life. He never feared this or that, but he did this as a desire to be part of God's kingdom and wanting to be part of God's company. And then he continues to mention this. He says, I wish to always be a boy and to be permitted to accompany these saints, those three saints that we had mentioned earlier. So there's a sense that this childlike love of God and this childlike desire to be with God eternally is something that was part of this testament that he celebrates. And then he's also admonishing those who will read this testament not to feel sad because of his death. And how often in the face of death, that is kind of one thing that we wish those that are left behind, that they're not saddened by our death, but they're gladdened and they rejoice in the fact that we've crossed over to a more fuller life with God.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in particularly for him, I remember someone in seminary, when I was in seminary, telling me, I'm just here to see if I make it day by day. And I thought, what a wonderful outlook, because too often if you go into seminary day one assuming that you've got the rest of your career and rest of your vocation already planned, it may not happen. And certainly I think he was even challenging those who had put him on the track to where he was. There would have been those that would have lamented. We're told that the bishop at the time, when he was in the United States studying at Belmont Abbey, saw great promise and great hope in him. So of course then he was advanced onto Rome. And even those that were part of his formation may have already planned his career and thought, oh, this will be one who moves on and becomes, perhaps a bishop or a great professor or whatever it is. I think he's admonishing all that, not to be disappointed, not to be saddened, not to feel like none of this mattered or it all fell apart, but that he was achieving what he wanted, and that was to be with God. And how often we have to remember that when our loved ones die, that they, as much as we would love to keep them with us, they are with God. Yeah,
and it's interesting, he closes his last will and testament saying, if it is God's will, I will join him on Good Friday in 1920 and never leave him more, not by my will, Father, but thine be done. And so there's this whole sense that it's ultimately God's will, whatever happens. But there's this foreboding that he has, this sense of when he gets to Rome to begin his studies to the priesthood, that something's going to happen. There's something in his mind and heart that tells him that he is not going to be around for the duration, and he will not even be ordained a priest. And so we lift him up. We celebrate him as someone who hopefully is on the way to sainthood, and those young people in our own families and friends who have passed, who have gone to eternal life. We pray to Frank Parater that the Lord will welcome them to the fullness of eternal life in heaven. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
We are in our 7th year, Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Father Stephen Eckert. He was a Capuchin who was born in Ontario, Canada, and he has a tremendous desire to work among African Americans. This was his calling, this was his desire. But let's go back to his early life and let's share some information with the folks that are with us about that.
Well, we know that he was born John Eckert. Stephen is his religious community name. He's born about 50 miles outside of Toronto, Canada, but his parents were from Bavaria, and they immigrated to Ontario, where they met and married. John was the middle of their 9 children, and has been the case of many of the saints that we've talked about from this time period, came from a very large, devout Catholic family. Attendance at Mass meant a 6-mile horseback ride, but they made sure that Sunday attendance at Mass was crucial to who they were. If weather prevented them, then the neighbors would gather together and create their own Sunday service. Certainly not the priests celebrating Mass, but how important that is perhaps to us today to recognize that people were still coming together in prayer and coming together to praise and to thank God. We know that he attended school and grew up with a love of religious life and had a desire to join the Capuchins, of which he was schooled by.
And we know that he was drawn really to the Capuchins because of their presence in his own life. And so he does go to the monastery in Detroit, where he enters a novitiate in 1891. He, as you had mentioned, was given the religious name of Stephen, perhaps maybe after Stephen Martyr, the first Christian martyr. And then after a year there, he studied for 4 years at a major seminary in Milwaukee. And while there, he was trained to be a good preacher, listening to sermons and then discussing those sermons with his fellow seminarians. He was ordained a priest on July 2nd, 1896, and for the next 17 years, he had various assignments in New York, in Detroit, in the Midwest, and then he goes back to several parishes in New York. But during most of his time, it was spent conducting retreats or serving as a hospital chaplain. But then he had this desire to work with fallen away Catholics and those who were had no faith at all. And so there's this sense that his desire to bring people back into the fold, probably because he was so devout in his own Catholic faith. And as he sees those people falling away from practicing their faith, he has this tremendous desire to bring them back. But then he also has an experience with African Americans where he kind of changes his desire and his mission. So let's talk about his mission among the African Americans.
Well, and certainly in his time frame of ministry, his ordination is about 30 some years after the Civil War, but still there's a great deal of racism abound, as there still is today in our country. So his faith and his desire to serve God really starts to focus in on what he considers to be the most vulnerable in society, those who are the most disenfranchised. And so he has a desire to reach out to the African American community. He starts serving at St. John the Baptist Church in Midtown Manhattan, and then he moves on to Philadelphia. And what's interesting there is he's not alone in this desire and ministry to serve the African American communities. He actually goes to the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament to learn more about how to minister to the African American community. And this, of course, is the community that is established by Catherine Drexel, now St. Catherine, who herself was a woman of wealth, a woman of prestige, orphaned, and searching for how to live her life. And she starts this community to specifically minister to African American and Native American individuals, the most vulnerable, again, of our society.
You know, it's interesting then, in 1905, then Father Stephen expressed to his superiors that he wanted to become an itinerant missionary among poor blacks in the South. And so his superiors investigated the possibility of him doing that, but rejected that. But then he goes back to St. John's Church in New York, where he actually works among the black population, in addition to other duties there. And then it was in 1911 that an Archbishop of Milwaukee establishes a special community. So what is this community that Father Stephen joins?
Well, the community that's established, and it's very interesting that it's established back in the early 1900s, is specifically to minister to African Americans. It is named St. Benedict the Moor Mission, and he entrusted to the care of the Capuchin friars. And so certainly we must think that, you know, for Stephen, who was rejected from doing this itinerant preaching in the South to black individuals, he sees this as a great possibility. And we know that then 2 years later, in 1913, he's assigned to that mission.
You know, it's interesting because as he is experiencing this desire to work with African Americans, he's also experiencing criticism among people because of his affection for the black community. And even he gets that from some of his own brother priests. And you have to understand how hurtful or how disappointing that would be for Father Eckert, because this is his call, this is his mission, and the people who he's serving with tell him that he shouldn't even be wasting his time or his desire to do this. But then we see that after 10 years with this congregation of St. Benedict the Moor, that he eventually contracts pneumonia, and he dies on February 16th, 1923, at the age of 53. And then there's a special statue in closing. Let's share that.
Well, there was such love. As you said, he dealt with such difficulties from other people. And what a letdown, as you said, it must have been from his brother Capuchins, that he would have thought all of them would have the same love of all God's children as he did. But the people of that mission, the people he ministered to for 10 years, recognized his great work and his great efforts, and perhaps the own personal costs that it brought to him, that they erect a life-size statue of him, and they call him their apostle and their champion. And so that stands to this day.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.